So the Eric Williams book is this sort of phenomena that's always sort of resisting the dominant mainstream historiography of slavery. And there's going to be a number of people come along and say, let's build on on Eric Williams. I'm just picking one here that's sort of one that is often read in grad schools right now, and that's Robert Drayton, The Collaboration of Labor. This is not the only one. It's not even the definitive one. Honestly, Eric Williams is the definitive one, but we're just going to build on this a little bit. And I think you're going to see parallels here with the 1619 project. So he's going to begin with this idea that global integration, or what we call globalization, between 1600 and 1850, this sort of era we're talking about here, it really rested on the back of black slaves. Again, if we go to the mainstream historiography, it's going to be about things like industrialization. It's going to be about things like explorers. It's going to be about things like, it's often going to be about things like European entrepreneurs who go out there, and while imperialism and colonialism is kind of I mean, that human European spirit going out there and doing it. But what Drayton argues is what it really is it's all built on the labor of slaves and the commodification of people in the form of slavery. So global integration really rests on the back of slaves who shaped the sugar plantation system. Remember, this is what we're talking about with mass slaves. It was a really messy, dangerous thing to be working on a sugar plantation. It burned through people very quickly. So globalization, here's the definition he's going to use, which is not the one we often talk about in economics, but it's kind of a good one. The context in which labor, under various forms of compulsion, whether, for example, I decide to work for wage, or whether I'm forced to work as a slave, or various other systems that are sort of in between that, were context in which labor is allied or collaborates across the planet towards meeting what one party it thinks it needs or towards meeting what one party thinks it needs, that shouldn't be in it there, thinks it needs or wants. So in this case, the thing that really was driving the global economy at this point is a few things, but one of the big things was sugar. Sugar was a huge deal. In 17th century, Europeans needed/wanted sugar. And they were willing to pay good money for sugar. And so that meant that there were people who were willing to set up sugar plantations. Now they still want to make a profit. Sugar is incredibly valuable, so there's a lot of incentive for people to supply sugar. Sugar is very labor intensive, and it was located in very harsh regions where essentially you're not going to get a lot of people to voluntarily say, yes, I'll move there and work in this really crappy environment where I'm going to get paid very little and probably die very quickly. Which means that there is going to be a labor gap. And in that labor supply never met the demand, even when they tried to use the Native Americans. It just didn't sort of work. The gap gets filled by slaves. It was really the only way to make sugar plantations profitable at the time. So that's essentially what happens. It's not, again, the argument being here, it's not the entrepreneurship of the person who goes and forms a sugar plantation or the first colonists who come over and set that up. It's built on the back of the slaves who are coerced into providing this. If you don't have slaves, you don't have the sugar plantation. You don't have sugar plantations, you don't have this of that era. The Atlantic slave economy then shapes the entire global economy. You've probably heard about the triangular trade. This right here is the triangular trade, where essentially textiles go down here in exchange for slaves. Slaves go to the Americas in exchange for things like sugar, tobacco, cotton, like that. And that keeps going. British dominance from the 18th century on is really funded by this trade. The British are benefiting because of their sugar plantations over there, which are using slave labor. British also tend to be the ones who are the slave traders themselves. So they're benefiting from the sugar produced by slaves as a commodity. So that's essentially what allowed the British to move from being sort of, fourth or fifth at the beginning of the 18th century to first place by the 18th century. You can't just sort of go back and sort of rewrite history and say Britain didn't slavery wasn't essential to Britain's economic success and military success and cultural success. So essentially, there's a circularity of the economy. The European traders took materials and labor from outside Europe, and then they used the capital they had from that to fund the ability to do this more. So again, that's also part of this triangular trade, but instead of stuff, we're talking about essentially money, and money in this part in the form of slaves, and on and on. So the point that Drayton wants to make, and again, I don't want to harp too much on this argument here, but the point Drayton wants to make is not that Europe went over and expropriated wealth from the rest of the world. That's a very common way to put this. I'll probably put it like this because it's just an easy way to phrase it. Europe went and took stuff from other places. And here's why he doesn't want to say that. Because if that's the case, then at some point Europe could just say, we'll stop doing that. And that's not exactly what it was. It was this. The system was constructed in such a way that tended and still tends to allocate to the West a disproportionate share of the power to command and consume resources. In other words, it wasn't just we're going to show up essentially like a thief and take stuff. We're going to set up a system in which the taking stuff is legitimate, it is legal. In fact, there's really not a lot of other ways to think about it. The modern capitalist system essentially has resources from outside the West flowing into the West, and we don't really ask too much questions about it because that's how capitalism works. So it must be the way it should work. And that's the thing that Drayton and Williams are really trying to critique. 19th century, there's these changes. By the 1820s, Britain abolishes slavery and the slave trade for itself. It doesn't abolish it for the rest of the world, though at some point it will, but essentially says not in the British Empire anymore. But one of the main reasons that Drayton points out, that Williams also pointed out, is that it's because sugar wasn't that big part of the community, of the economy anymore for Britain. The British colonies were starting to move toward cotton, and especially the British Empire. Cotton was the whole thing, to be brought back to the factories back in Britain to be turned into textiles. Sugar was great, but it wasn't cotton. Cotton was the new thing. Cotton was king. And so cotton didn't require slavery, at least it didn't require it on behalf of the British. Let me phrase it differently. Cotton used slavery at this point. It's just that the British weren't the ones who were growing the cotton. They were buying the cotton. So they didn't need slavery anymore. Others did. So the U.S. sources, of course, used slaves. Indian sources used systems that were all but slavery. They weren't necessarily slavery in the chattel slavery system, but man, most historians look and economists look at the systems that were set up in India and they say, it's not slavery, but only because it's not the dictionary definition of slavery. So what this meant was, according to Drayton, Britain could claim the high road. We don't do slavery. Slavery sucks. Human rights, all that kind of stuff. You shouldn't do slavery either. So they could claim the high road, but they could also profit because, again, it's one of those indirect things. It's, I guess the best way I can put it is American companies, for example, don't use child labor to get cocoa from West Africa. What they do is they purchase cocoa from West Africa. If those places that they purchase it from happen to use child labor, my company didn't use child labor, so that's on them, it's not on me. So if I choose to buy it and if the consumer chooses to use it, they are guilt-free, even though child labor was a part of the process. That's sort of the similarity of this thing. Britain wasn't using slaves anymore, but Britain was relying upon a commodity that relied upon slavery or slave-like systems. I can't even say it. Bottom line, last slide. The slavery's economy, according to Drayton, the slavery economy's impact, let me say it that way. The impact of the slavery economy did not end with abolition, and it did not end with decolonization. In the same way the 1619 Project is saying essentially, yeah, you did the revolution, you did all sorts of other things, civil rights movement, the impact is still here among us. And that's the same thing here that Drayton is arguing, and a lot of authors argue that are a little bit out of the mainstream, what we call, again, post-colonial authors. The winners of the Atlantic slave system shaped the system to their liking. So as conditions changed, for example, slavery was no longer an essential element of it, and they moved to more of a wage capital, global capitalist free trade, they still got to shape that system. And of course they're going to shape it in a way that supports them. They have no incentive to shape it in a way that makes it less profitable. So what we're going to see, this idea of division of labor imperialism, where essentially the Europeans as consumers, the non-Europeans as the producers doing sort of the heavy labor, and then the Europeans will turn it into the good stuff. You know, that sort of division of labor of imperialism, even though imperialism doesn't technically exist today, neo-imperialism being the exception there, that is still what is today, according to Drayton, the system's endless quest for cheaper labor. So again, sweatshops and that sort of that drive to push prices down as much as possible. So if things get too expensive in this country, we're just going to move our factories to a country where the wages are even less. The growing inequities of wealth in the global system, that it's not, according to this argument, it's not a big surprise that countries in Africa are underdeveloped. Again, and he's going to come to the same conclusion that Williams is going to make, which is that the economics drives the right. In other words, the humanitarian moral arguments follow from the economic interest, not the other way around. That's not the story we want to tell ourselves. The story we want to tell ourselves is that humanity is sort of getting better, that we are learning, that we are better than we were 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And what Williams is arguing, Drayton's arguing, and honestly even the 1619 Project to some degree is arguing, what drove those good changes was not good impulses, but economics, and the humanitarian sort of justifications come along after the fact. We didn't change slavery. Humanity didn't sort of end slavery because humanity is inherently good and getting better. They did it because it was no longer profitable. And then we retroactively say, nah, it's because we're really nice people and we're great. This is one of the things we're going to sort of see as we go through this. Again, I don't need you to know this in particular. I just wanted you to see this other aspect, this other push of historiography on slavery. That's it. Thanks, guys.